In the early hours of the 7th of February, 1943, Commander Howard W. Gilmore was wounded on the bridge of USS Growler. The submarine was still on the surface. The night around her was broken by gunfire, shouted orders, and the violence of a fight that had closed too fast to control. Growler had been operating in dangerous waters of the Southwest Pacific, but now, the danger was no longer somewhere beyond the darkness. It was on top of her. It was close enough to strike the bridge. Close enough to trap her captain outside his own submarine. Below Gilmore, the conning tower hatch stood open. That hatch was the narrow passage between life and death. Below it were the men of Growler, waiting for the one order that could save them. Above it was their captain, wounded, exposed, and unable to get below in time. The submarine needed to dive immediately. Every second on the surface made Growler more vulnerable. A submarine was never meant to survive long like this, exposed in the dark with enemy fire around her and damage already done. On the surface, she was a target. Underwater, she still had a chance, but she could not dive with her captain still on the bridge unless he gave the order. That was the impossible choice. If Growler waited, the crew might get Gilmore back inside. They might pull him through the hatch. They might save their captain. But waiting could cost the submarine itself. It could cost every man below. It could turn one wounded commander into a lost boat and a dead crew. If Growler dove, the men below might live. But Gilmore would be left behind. This was not a clean battlefield decision made from a map table. There was no time to weigh it slowly. There was no safe option. There was only a damaged submarine, a wounded captain, an open hatch, and the knowledge that command sometimes comes down to a few seconds when every choice takes something away. Inside the submarine, the crew depended on him. They could not simply abandon him. They could not decide for him. A submarine captain was not just another man aboard. His command held the boat together. His voice mattered. His order mattered. And now the men below were waiting for that voice. On the bridge, Gilmore understood what the delay meant. The longer Growler remained surfaced, the greater the danger became. Enemy fire had already reached them. The surface fight had already gone wrong. The bridge was no longer a place of command. It was a place the submarine had to leave behind. The men below needed depth. They needed darkness. They needed the ocean to close over them before the enemy could finish what it had started. But their captain was still above the hatch. That is why this moment has endured. Not because it was loud, not because it was clean, not because it gave anyone an easy answer. It endured because Howard W. Gilmore faced a decision that no commander would ever want placed before him. He could make his crew wait for him, or he could save them from him. The submarine could not do both. Hours earlier, USS Growler had still been moving through the Pacific as a fighting submarine on patrol. It was February 1943, during Growler's fourth war patrol, and the boat was operating in the dangerous waters of the Southwest Pacific. Out there, distance could be deceptive. The ocean looked open, but it was crowded with danger. Enemy ships, patrol craft, aircraft, reefs, darkness, and the constant possibility that one wrong sighting could turn a hunter into a target. Growler was built for concealment, patience, and sudden violence. Her strength was not armor. Her strength was surprise. She could move unseen below the surface, strike with torpedoes, then disappear before the enemy could answer. But when a submarine was forced to fight on the surface, especially at close range, everything changed. The bridge became exposed. The men topside became vulnerable. And the submarine herself became something she was never meant to be for long, a visible target in enemy waters. That night, Growler was not in a safe place. and every man aboard understood it. The crew did not need a lecture on the Pacific War to know the rules of survival. They lived them every hour. Sound mattered. Darkness mattered. Recognition mattered. A shape on the horizon could be nothing, or it could be the beginning of a fight that would give them only seconds to react. Howard W. Gilmore was the man responsible for those seconds. He was not an inexperienced officer caught by surprise in a war he did not understand. Gilmore was an experienced U.S. Navy submarine commander, a man who had already carried the burden of command beneath the surface of the Pacific. His crew knew his voice. They knew that when he gave an order, he was thinking not only of the boat, but of the men sealed inside her steel hull. That is the only biography this story needs early on. Gilmore mattered here because he was the kind of commander whose decisions had weight before the crisis came. In a submarine, command was intimate. There were no wide battlefields, no distant lines of troops, no commander watching through field glasses from miles away. There was only a narrow vessel, crowded compartments, limited air, machinery, pressure, darkness, and men who had to trust that the person above them could make the right decision before it was too late. On the night of February 7, that trust would be tested in a way none of them could have wanted. As Growler continued her patrol, contact developed with a Japanese surface vessel. In the darkness, the encounter closed fast. What might have been a distant threat became immediate. The enemy vessel was no longer just a mark somewhere beyond the black water. It was moving close enough to force action. At first, the situation still had the shape of a naval encounter. There was a vessel, there was a submarine, there was the possibility of maneuver, of attack, of escape. But close range at night stripped away every comfortable assumption. A submarine commander had to judge not only what the enemy was doing, but how quickly the geometry of the fight was changing. If the enemy closed too far, Growler could be rammed or forced into a collision. If Growler stayed exposed too long, she could be hit. If the crew hesitated, the night itself could become a trap. Gilmore and the men on the bridge had to read the danger in fragments, the outline of the enemy vessel, the speed of approach, the position of Growler, the angle of threat, and the terrible narrowing of time. Below them, most of the crew remained inside the submarine, separated from the fight by steel, instruments, orders, and trust. They could not see everything the captain saw. They could only wait for what he would decide. Then the enemy vessel closed with dangerous purpose. The encounter was no longer routine. It was no longer a patrol contact that could be handled calmly from a distance. Growler was being pulled into the kind of surface fight that submariners feared, fast, close, confused, and unforgiving. The submarine still had a chance. But that chance depended on speed. It depended on command. It depended on getting below the surface before the enemy could turn Growler's exposed position into a fatal weakness. Then the first danger became the closing distance. In the darkness of the Southwest Pacific, Growler could not treat the Japanese vessel as a distant shape anymore. It was coming in too close, too fast, and with too much purpose. What had begun as a night contact was turning into a fight at the worst possible range for a submarine on the surface. Growler still had movement. She still had command. She still had men at their stations who knew their duties. But the margin was shrinking by the second. A submarine could be powerful when she struck from concealment. On the surface, at night, with an enemy vessel bearing down, she was something far more vulnerable. Her pressure hull could take the sea, but her bridge could not take a close fight forever. The men topside were exposed to everything the darkness suddenly threw at them. Gilmore had to act before the enemy dictated the fight completely. The Japanese vessel tried to close the distance as if it meant to force Growler into a collision. That alone could have ended the patrol. A submarine's hull was not just a shell around machinery. It was the boat's survival. Damage in the wrong place could trap her on the surface, break her ability to dive, or leave the crew fighting the ocean itself. Then, the situation became even more dangerous. The night erupted with gunfire. The bridge, which only moments before had been the command position, became the most exposed place on the boat. Men who had been looking into the dark, judging distance and movement, were suddenly under fire at close range. The encounter was no longer a matter of maneuver alone. It had become a violent surface fight, and Growler was being punished for every second she remained above the water. Below, the rest of the submarine depended on fragments. They heard movement, they heard orders, they felt the change in urgency. They knew when a routine command became something sharper. In a submarine, men learned to read danger through sound and vibration. A door, a bell, a shouted instruction, a sudden rush down a ladder, each could tell them that the world above had changed. And now it had changed completely. Crewmen from the bridge began rushing below through the conning tower hatch. That hatch was narrow, and in a crisis, it became a bottleneck between exposure and safety. Every man who made it down brought the submarine one step closer to being able to dive. Every man still above kept the boat tied to the surface. Gilmore remained on the bridge. He was not removed from the fight by distance. He was in the center of it, where the danger was loudest and nearest. Around him, the surface action had become confused and violent, but the basic truth was simple. Growler could not stay there. The submarine had to get under. That was the one thing the enemy could not easily follow. Beneath the surface, Growler might be damaged, shaken, and hunted, but she would no longer be exposed in the same way. On the surface, she remained visible. She remained reachable. She remained in the place where the enemy's fire and movement could still destroy her. Then came the wound that changed the command problem into something worse. Gilmore was hit on the bridge. Others near him had also been struck or forced below, and the fight that had already been dangerous now became almost unbearable. The captain, the man whose order was needed, was still outside the submarine. He was above the open hatch. The crew below was waiting. The enemy danger had not passed. The boat was still surfaced. There was no clean solution. If the men below delayed, they might be able to recover him, but delay meant remaining exposed. Delay meant giving the enemy more time. Delay meant asking every man aboard to remain in a deadly position because their captain was not yet inside. If they dove without him, the submarine might live. But that decision could not be treated as a mechanical step. It was not just flooding tanks and slipping beneath the surface. It meant leaving the captain on the bridge because the captain himself understood that the boat mattered more than the man commanding it. Inside Growler, the executive officer faced a terrible pause. He knew the submarine had to dive. He knew the captain was still topside. He knew that no officer wanted to mistake urgency for abandonment. The men below were not trying to leave Gilmore. They were waiting for him, waiting for his movement, waiting for his voice, waiting for the command that would make the decision clear. Above them, the bridge was no longer a command post in any ordinary sense. It was a place the submarine had to escape from. The open hatch below Gilmore was still there, but the distance to it had become impossible. A few feet on a submarine could become greater than an ocean when seconds were gone and enemy fire had already found the bridge. The crew had done what they could. The boat was ready to go down. The enemy had made waiting more dangerous than diving. And in that narrow space between command and sacrifice, Howard W. Gilmore understood that the next order would decide whether USS Growler survived the night. The executive officer waited. The men below waited. And the captain above them had only one command left that could save his crew. The open hatch was only a few feet away. But in that moment, for Howard W. Gilmore, a few feet might as well have been a mile. USS Growler was still on the surface. The bridge above the submarine was exposed to the night, to the enemy, and to the gunfire that had already torn the fight apart. Below that bridge, through the conning tower hatch, was the only place the submarine still had a chance to live. The men who could get below had gone below. The boat was waiting, and Gilmore was still outside. There was no dramatic speech to give, no time for explanation, no room for ceremony. The submarine was caught inside the final seconds of a decision that could not be postponed. If Growler stayed where she was, she remained visible, vulnerable, and reachable. The enemy had already proved that the bridge could be hit. The next moments could bring more fire, more damage, or another collision close enough to finish the submarine. The surface had become a trap. Inside the boat, the men needed the order to dive. They needed the ballast tanks to flood. They needed the hull to slip beneath the black Pacific water. They needed the submarine to become what it was designed to be again, hidden, moving, alive below the surface. But the captain was still on the bridge. That fact held everything in place. A submarine crew did not lightly close a hatch over its own commanding officer. They did not decide on their own that the captain could be left above. The men below were not abandoning Gilmore. They were waiting because command still belonged to him. His voice was still the authority that could turn hesitation into action. And every second of waiting was dangerous. The executive officer knew what had to happen, but he also knew what it meant. Somewhere above him, Gilmore was wounded and unable to make it down through the hatch in time. Somewhere above him, the captain was still in the exposed darkness. Below him were the compartments of Growler, filled with men whose lives now depended on a choice no officer would ever want to make. The silence before the command may have lasted only a moment, but it carried the weight of the entire boat. Gilmore had already done what a captain could do in the fight. He had maneuvered Growler through a violent surface encounter. He had kept command while the enemy closed in. He had ordered his men below. He had given the submarine the possibility of escape. Now the last obstacle to that escape was himself. That was the terrible clarity of the moment. If he demanded that the boat wait, the crew would try to wait. They would risk the submarine for him. They would risk every man below for the chance that he could still be brought through the hatch. A captain could ask that of his crew. Gilmore did not. He understood that the submarine was bigger than the man commanding it. He understood that the lives below him now mattered more than his own chance to get below. He understood that the final duty of command was not to be saved by his men, but to save them when the decision narrowed to one impossible order. Above him was enemy fire. Below him was the open hatch. Inside that hatch were the men who trusted him. The order had to come from him, because only he could make it clear that the crew was not leaving him by choice. He was choosing for them. He was removing doubt from the men below. He was taking the burden of the decision onto himself, where command had always placed it. Then Howard W. Gilmore gave the order that would become inseparable from his name. Take her down. The words were short. They had to be. There was no time for anything else. For the men inside Growler, those words changed everything. They were not permission to forget their captain. They were not an act of panic. They were the final command of a wounded officer who knew exactly what he was ordering and why it had to be done. The hatch was closed. Growler began to dive. The submarine that had been exposed on the surface started to disappear beneath the Pacific. The bridge, the gunfire, the night air, and the wounded captain were left above as the ocean came over the boat. Below, the crew carried out the order with the discipline Gilmore had trusted them to have. No man in that submarine could mistake what had happened. Their captain had not been left behind because he was forgotten. He had been left behind because he ordered it. As Growler went under, the immediate danger did not vanish. The boat was damaged. The crew still had to fight the submarine, control her, and keep her alive beneath the surface. They had to move from shock into duty because that was what Gilmore's order required of them. Grief would come later. Understanding would come later. Survival had to come first. Below the surface, USS Growler was still in danger. The dive had saved the submarine from the exposed violence of the surface, but it did not erase what had happened. The boat was damaged. Her crew had been shaken by the attack. And now they had to do the one thing Howard W. Gilmore's final order had made possible. They had to keep Growler alive. There was no time to stop and fully absorb the loss. Submariners understood that survival often came first, even when grief was already inside the boat with them. Men had to return to their stations. Damage had to be controlled. Depth had to be managed. The submarine had to be handled carefully enough to escape the enemy and remain seaworthy. And she did. USS Growler survived the night. The men below, the men Gilmore had chosen to save, brought the damaged submarine safely back. They lived because, in the final seconds on the surface, their captain refused to let them risk the boat for him. His last command did not remove the pain of what happened. It gave the crew a way through it. 5. Howard W. Gilmore was lost at sea. He did not return to the conning tower. He did not come back down through the hatch. The same opening that had offered him a chance to live became the line he chose not to hold the submarine to. For the men inside Growler, that knowledge would have been impossible to forget. A commander had ordered them to leave him behind, not because they wanted to, not because they failed him, because he understood that their survival required it. For that act, Commander Howard W. Gilmore was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation recognized not only his courage under fire, but the terrible command decision at the center of the story. Wounded, exposed, and unable to get below, he gave the order that saved his submarine and crew. But the deeper legacy of Gilmore's final order is not held only in a medal. It is held in the image of a submarine bridge at night, an open hatch below, and a captain who knew that one more delay could cost every man aboard. It is held in the discipline of the crew who obeyed an order no one wanted to hear. It is held in the silence after the words were spoken, when the boat went down and the captain stayed above. Take her down. 3 words. A command. A sacrifice. A decision that made survival possible for everyone below him. For history reframed, stories like this matter because they do not make war look glorious. They show the weight carried by ordinary men placed in extraordinary positions and the cost hidden inside the word duty. If this story matters to you, consider subscribing to History Reframed. Each story preserved here helps keep alive the memory of people who faced moments history should not forget. Howard W. Gilmore's final order was not about dying bravely. It was about giving his crew the chance to live.